This is Half-Life 2. It was released in 2004, although the version you'd be playing on Steam nowadays is mostly based on the 2007 version that came with some engine upgrades, so it didn't look quite like this in 2004, but that's not the point. Do you notice anything? How about these crummy-looking textures off in the distance? This is running at mostly maximum settings. I've disabled anti-aliasing and motion blur because I don't really like how they look, but I've also disabled a very important setting. So let's turn that setting on now. So now we've enabled our special setting, and suddenly those textures look way better. So what's happening here? Did I buff the texture quality? Did I install a high-resolution texture pack? Well, what I enabled is a technique called anisotropic filtering. To better understand what it does, we're going to need to talk about a different technique called mipmaps. Mipmaps are mostly just lower resolution versions of existing textures, but the way they're applied is what makes them unique. Mipmaps are almost exclusively used for textures being rendered at a distance. You might think this is to help boost performance, since there's no point in rendering a supremely detailed texture if you won't even see the detail so far away. And you'd be right, that is a benefit provided by mipmaps, but another reason they're so useful is because they help clean up any noisiness or graininess that you might see if you're looking at a texture from too far away. If the texture is only taking up so many pixels on the screen, trying to fit absurd amounts of texture detail into that little area is not going to look great. Mipmaps look pretty good when you're looking at a texture head-on, but here comes a problem. Shallow angles. When you're looking at textures at shallow angles, like the floor and walls here, these mipmaps turn into a blurry mess. This is hard to avoid with mipmaps alone because you are literally just rendering lower resolution versions of textures. The illusion is broken. Well, here comes anisotropic filtering with the steel chair. Throw this setting on and suddenly the mipmaps are way less blurry. Problem solved, I'd say. The absence of anisotropic filtering is a big reason why older games, or even newer games on lower graphics settings, tend to look so much worse than you might remember. If you enable the setting in Half-Life 1, which I think it's on by default in the current Steam version, you can see it makes a gigantic difference and the game looks just slightly less old. And its presence is why emulated 3D games can sometimes look so much better than you might remember. It can completely change your perception of texture detail. So if mipmaps are just lower resolution copies of textures, what is anisotropic filtering doing? Well, instead of shrinking the texture both horizontally and vertically, like with mipmaps, anisotropic filtering shrinks textures on one axis. In a way, it's basically a more flexible version of mipmaps. Shrinking one axis gives you a much better idea of what a mipmap should look like at a sharp angle. So what's the catch? Well, nowadays this is less of a problem, but the main reason this is a setting instead of just built into the mipmap feature is because it requires you to hold a lot more copies of a texture. The bigger that texture is, and the more textures you have, the worse it gets. In 2004 or even 2007, anisotropic filtering was surprisingly heavy on performance. With the computers of today, it's not so bad, but games are using bigger and bigger textures, so it makes sense to keep this as its own option. Alright, so now you know a lot about mipmaps, and you might be wondering, if mipmaps are just lower resolution copies of a texture, what's stopping you from changing what those copies actually have in them? And in fact, there is nothing stopping you from changing that. In Super Mario Sunshine, Nintendo uses mipmaps to give the water its iconic shine at specific distances, and even to change the color of the water depending on distance. If you emulate the game in Dolphin, you can disable these custom mipmaps and allow Dolphin to generate its own using anisotropic filtering. This completely breaks the water effect. Luckily, you can just re-enable arbitrary mipmaps to get the best of both worlds. In the Super Mario Galaxy games, mipmaps are used for several different effects. The examples I'm showing here are the glow on this lava in Galaxy 1, and this fog effect for a skybox in Galaxy 2. Call of Duty World War II uses mipmaps to make glossy surfaces less glossy at a distance. This is a pretty effective trick that helps get rid of that weird, unrealistic glow that some modern games have on their surfaces. It also helps reduce any noisiness caused by the way the light is hitting these surfaces, because yes, lighting can cause that too. Aren't 3D graphics just wonderful? In the description, I've linked some resources that talk a little more about these examples, and even some examples I didn't cover, so be sure to check those out too. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want me to make more videos talking about stuff like this, drop a comment about it. See ya!